Sarah. Virginia got in touch with me earlier today to tell me that she wasn't going to make the meeting. So we have all board members present that who we are going to make it. So will the secretary call the roll, please?
On order of my screen, Marianne Monraj. Marianne, you're muted.
Present.
Ted Voss.
Was that Ted Foss? He's here.
Ted Voss. Matt Ruth.
Present.
Christian Harris.
Here.
Colleen Burns.
Here.
And that's everyone, I believe. Sarah Glavin is present.
Excellent. Moving on to the approval of minutes, we have 2 sets of minutes from our practice meeting on April 23rd and our regular meeting on the 28th. Is there any corrections that need to be made? Okay. Is there a motion to approve?
Motion to approve, Ted Foss.
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Christian. Any further discussion? Hearing none, will the secretary take the roll call vote, please?
Marianne Monraj. I'm sorry. Marianne Monraj.
Approve.
Ted Voss.
Approve.
Matt Ruth.
Yes.
Christian Harris.
Approved.
Colleen Burns.
Yes.
Sarah Glavin also approves.
All right, the minutes are approved. Moving on to community member and visitor comments. I had not received anything, any comments via my email account. David, did you receive any, or were there any web form submissions?
No, I have not received any, Matt.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to trustee comments and board calendar.
I simply want to commend Marianne for her book, if you can see this.
Thanks, Ted.
And it reads really very well. I love that sometimes she goes, well, this particular ingredient isn't terrible.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's very conversational, I think. So I had my sort of my adult kids in mind for who would eventually be reading that. So it's as if I'm explaining things to my daughter. So
That is often a good approach to when preparing educational documents. So, any other?
I hope everybody's doing well. Just wanted to say I officially miss being in the same room with you all and discussing this, especially as we dig in tonight to Rashida's report. So I hope you all are doing well, and I am excited to, in a couple of months, hopefully be able to be in the same room again.
And this is Ted Foss again. I want to thank David for his really nice responses to community concerns about reopening.
mm-hmm.
Thanks, Ted.
Okay. Regarding the board calendar, it's very thin, you will notice. We are, I was communicated with David in the last week about, our meetings on the issue of whether virtual or in person. And right now, the conversation he and I had came around to, barring any special or further developments, planning to still meet virtually in June and July, and then meeting in person in August. Of course, if things are roaring along, well, in the good way. In July, we, possibly meeting in person in July, but for the time being, to focus on letting staff get their feet under them, under, the new reopening procedures and practices in June and July before we all gather in the room. And I asked him to block off the veterans room for our meetings from starting in August through the end of the year, so that we can provide as much social distancing, appropriate distancing during our meetings, in-person meetings, as possible.
And I've done that, Matt. The veterans room is reserved for the remainder of the meetings for the year.
Thank you. If there's no other trustee comments or questions about the board calendar, we can move on.
Matt, I don't know
Yes.
if this is a trustee comment, not necessarily for this. I never know where to put these things in. Maybe for the next meeting to think about for the agenda. One thing that I've been hearing a lot of community concern about is, of course, the schools, especially for those with younger kids. And I wonder whether the library should be thinking ahead towards the fall, whether there are ways that we can support the schools, especially if they're continuing to do remote learning at this point. So I mostly just wanted to put it on everyone's radar. As you know, is there going to be some possibility of collaboration, partnership for when school starts up again? Because it's clear that it's going to be a huge challenge for everyone in education. So.
Agreed. Point well taken. David, let's make a note to discuss having that on our next agenda or two, depending on where we're at with things in either June or July.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Nothing else for trustee comments or board calendar. We'll move on to new business. The anti-racism journey report and proposal from Rashida Graham-Washington, who I see on our participants list.
Hi, everyone. I'm here.
Excellent. Welcome.
Good to see you all. If only on Zoom.
Yes. So Rashida, if you would like to go ahead and we've all had a chance to look at your report over the last several days, but I turn it over to you to go ahead.
Okay. I don't know how extensive I should be. I'm sure you've recognized from this report that I can be a tad verbose. So I want to honor your time. I can walk you through the trajectory if you feel like that's appropriate. If you don't need that, then I can just answer any questions you have. What do you prefer?
If you can go through the trajectory a little bit, and then we'll kick it up, and then we'll hand it over and we'll let the trustees ask questions regarding any specifics.
That sounds great. Okay. So I participated in the discovery, and you all received a little bit of feedback from that experience when I met with you all way back in February, which feels like 9 years ago now. So we spent about 30 hours doing interviews with over about 50 different constituents and representative stakeholders for the library. And as the report indicates, there are some key strengths that came out of that process. One is that's really huge is that the library recognizes, understands, and acknowledges that there is anti-racist practices embedded in traditions and policies that currently exist. Though there has been a lot of work to change that trajectory, there's yet work to be done. There's a willingness to do that work and awareness and a posture, though there are pockets of posturing, I would say. There are some gaps in people's capacity to exhibit a posture for anti-racism, but by and large, there is a readiness, a willingness, and a posture to move forward in anti-racist work. Some of the challenges is that racism has been historically pervasive in some of the systems and policies that preceded this current administration. And as such, there is marginalization that continues to occur. And that it is difficult to talk about those gaps in margin when the constituents and stakeholders don't share a common language on how to have those conversations. And when certain language, vocabulary mean different things to different people, or is loaded with particular negative innuendo or negative power usage. So part of the challenge in having the discourse is that there's not a commonality in a language around anti-racism or how that language can be used. There is a history and tradition around meritocracy and the library as a neutral space. And so, and how people understand what meritocracy and neutrality are is impacting our capacity to have conversations that are anti-racist. There's work yet to be done around relational trust and power brokering. People hold positions, and those positions vary in terms of the amount of power people hold, even though they may be holding similar or same positions. So that was something that we were able to uncover, and that there's a gap between the ideal and the actual, where the library hopes to be and espouses to be, and where the library actually is on anti-racist work. There's a gap that exists between those two places, and this proposal trajectory sets out to help us narrow that gap. What I will say is, particularly as I speak about David and the work, the meetings and conversations we've had on this journey, nothing that I wrote in this proposal was news to the executive director, and I think that's really important. So we didn't illuminate anything as much as we confirmed gaps and challenges in anti-racist work that the executive director suspected was already existing. So what I've recommended is to break the work up into two phases. One exists in the year 2020, and this is, let's talk a little bit about 2020, shall we? 2020 is a year all its own, and it could, I think it's important for us to think about how do we do this work if we're not able to be in the same space, if we are still practicing social distancing, if we're still having to shelter in place and these kinds of things. So a lot of the preparation work would be happening in 2020, which includes the composition of an anti-racism advisory council. And that council can be composed, and that council can begin to work together in 2020 using technology like Zoom to make that happen. The other thing we really want to emphasize in 2020 is a preparedness in the executive leadership of the library to start to have executive leadership identify shared language, understand the gap between the ideal and the actual, and to have the executive board and the leadership of the library take that journey in some ways separate from other stakeholders, because this is a very vulnerable work. One of the things I shared with David was that this is not your typical HR experience. There's a lot of emotion involved. There's a lot of disorientation involved. It's a personal and vulnerable work. And so I would recommend that the executive leadership and the board of directors kind of start to take that journey to get ahead of the other stakeholders' process, so that when we do come together as a whole unit in 2021 to implement a strategic plan around anti-racist work, the board and the leaders of the library are not blindsided by the experience. They're not having it simultaneously with everyone else who's a stakeholder in the organization. Part of the work of 2020 is developing the advisory council, and then having that advisory council work with the consultant, which I'm proposing would be me, to generate a strategic plan for the integration of anti-racism work for the entire stakeholder unit in 2021. So most of what 2020 entails is preparatory work for a full-on integration in 2021. That would also, the work in 2020 would also comprise some auditing of systems, processes, protocols, procedures this is a way to get the advisory council's feet wet in using the shared language and the common experiences that they're having in 2020 to start developing their own lenses for where anti-racist practice may be occurring, so that they can be more fully capable and equipped to help lead that work in 2021. This would involve dedicated monthly time for the advisory team, the anti-racist advisory team, to get together with the consultant to start to take a look at policies and procedures, develop shared languages, have 3 to 5 learning experiences where they're building their skill set in anti-racism work, and that time is intentionally set aside for that to happen, as well as the development of a strategic plan that could ultimately be embedded into the larger strategic plan of the library. So I think because of where we are right now, we want to be intentional about developing an anti-racist strategic plan for the library. And then over time, because that work should touch every other work that the library is doing, that anti-racist lens then gets embedded into the larger strategic plan for the library. And then 2021, we will have the strategic plan that's been developed by way of this advisory council that is intersectional across stakeholder representation. And then 2021 would be the implementation of what that strategic plan is. It is important that the plan is developed that way so that there is ownership of the plan, and so that more than just the executive leadership team and the board can articulate the relevance and the significance of the objectives in the plan. Because this will have to be a work that is communicated effectively, and the more people we have with capacity to talk about it across stakeholdership, I think the more effective we'll be in getting buy-in from the community in what will definitely be a challenging journey, to be sure. So that's the gist of it, and I can answer any questions you have.
I do have a question. As you know, we've also been working with Harwood. And is that part of what you're looking at as well in coordinating with Harwood?
Yes, so the strategic plan that we would develop on anti-racism work would intersect the Harwood work to as much as possible, so that they feel synergistic rather than having 2 separate initiatives happening at the same time. We want to make sure that those things are, and that's not hard to do because of the essence of what Harwood is community listening, is sharing stories, it's empowering voices that haven't been traditionally empowered. That all fits very well into the work that the strategic plan would entail anyway.
Thank you.
Of course.
I'm sorry, this is Ted Foss again. I have another question about whether in this plan, we look at the history of anti-racism and all, and like looking at the history of anti-Asian things in World War II, attitudes in America toward the coronavirus, the China virus, all of those kinds of things. Is that something that we can bring into the conversation?
Said that all of that makes me incredibly excited to think about. I would say an emphatic yes. I think what has to be right at the forefront of conversation is how are we sharing stories? Because one question will be, why are we doing this? And I think opportunities to share stories of history and how those stories still intersect and are relevant to what we're experiencing right now, particularly during COVID, will help to illuminate the why. So I would say that that will easily be a part of the experience we share.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else have any? Christian, yeah.
I do have a comment. Well, I thought it was a really good report. I appreciated your analysis and your candor, and really appreciated you writing it in a way that I could understand. And I think it's very understandable by a lot of people on a spectrum. So I appreciated that as well. And looking forward to helping you helping us do this work. I do have 2 questions for you. The first one is under challenges, relational trust and power brokerage. And I'll just read the line and then I'll ask the question. Also, there's at a minimum the perception of inequity regarding budget dispensation and how disproportionately funding typically prioritizes the needs of white people over those who have been intentionally, historically, and intentionally marginalized. So I took that line kind of hard, I won't lie, because I feel like that speaks directly to how the board allocates our funding. And I was wondering if you had anything specific you heard during your talks regarding that. And yeah.
So I can give you an example, which I think will help clarify the extent to which the board may be complicit in this. So my understanding is that departments have funds that are allocated to the work they do departmentally. And once those funds have been allocated to that department, and this actually makes perfect sense to me, the leaders of that department have the autonomy as leaders to then disperse those funds based on what they think the priorities are. If the people at that level don't have an equity lens, they prioritize white-centered programming, resources, and activities at that level because number one, it's their primary constituency. I heard that. Number two, they don't know what else to give it to allocate it towards. And so there's this issue around some American Girl doll resources came up 9 times. I could say things about it. I'm like, this is a thing. These dolls have made a big splash in this community. And there were other pieces of programming that maybe were less dominant culture centered that, again, 9 times I heard should have been better prioritized. Issues around the teens that are coming in and don't have a place and this kind of thing. If this is a glaring issue, why aren't we allocating resources towards those concerns rather than spending the exorbitant, and that's a quote, exorbitant amount of money that we spent on American Girl dolls? So I give you that as an example. I don't think it's getting stuck at the executive board level. I think that if people don't have a lens toward anti-racism and they're being empowered in their roles as they should be, it's possible that they will center and prioritize things that don't empower historically, intentionally, and traditionally marginalized people groups.
Yeah. If I could jump in there, I'm going to ask David to think back to a conversation we had, I think before I ran for office, perhaps, when I was thinking about doing it, because I brought to him a concern that I was hearing from an Asian American parents group that had come and done programming at the library, and the library was great in that partnership, but then nobody picked it up and followed up with them and created an ongoing set of programs to continue to develop Asian American literary, whatever, projects. And I feel like to me, that's an example of the same kind of thing, right? Like, it's not that the library wasn't open to the programming being offered, they were, but they were not at the time sort of like set up to then think, okay, how can we now take this and build out ongoing anti-racist and culturally sensitive programming that will enhance the library as a whole. I don't know, maybe Rashida can speak to whether that is also the kind of thing you're thinking of or not.
Exactly right, Marianne. And I think part of what we're going to have to do when we're talking about language is mitigate binaries. That oftentimes when we start to talk about what hasn't been done for traditionally, historically, intentionally marginalized people groups, we pit it against some other thing. And in this case, it's American Girl dolls. I think we are in a position where we have some capacity to broaden our scope and say, what's a third way or a fifth way rather than an either or way that's often rooted in a scarcity mentality that the Oak Park Public Library doesn't necessarily have to even participate in. So how do we broaden the scope and be more inclusive without necessarily always having to revert back to what needs to be taken away if something is to be given? And I think that's part of the work of anti-racist efforts, for sure. Christian, does that help clarify a little bit?
It does, yes, that was helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
And I guess my other question is, well, one, I mean, it definitely seems like a lot of work. That's not really a question. But I guess my question is, some of this stuff feels like it needs to be enforced, I guess, for lack of a better word. Like it's going to, I don't know, I mean, it's nice to have a committee made up of stakeholders, you know, that come together, but are they really going to, when so-and-so doesn't do the one-on-one to address anti-racism work, is I think was one of your suggestions. How is that kind of enforced? And I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about this as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. In my experience over the discovery process, enforcement has not really been an acculturated aspect of the library's culture. But what we also know about anti-racist work is there will always be some group of people who feel like they shouldn't have to be made to do this thing, particularly because it's emotional, it's personal, it's vulnerable. It's less like other HR elements, if you will. And so I think bottom line, what we get in 2020 is a really good read on who those folks are going to be. And then from there, we can determine through differentiation, what is the best practice to get them on board, rather than developing a universal enforcement that might even negatively impact some people who otherwise would have been willing and had a desire to participate. So 2020 kind of gives us a read on how many of those folks are we talking about? Do we need policy and protocol for that? Or do we need to have some individual conversations? I think 2020 helps us kind of illuminate where we are with that.
And if,
That makes sense. Thank you. No, I was just saying that makes sense. Thank you. Appreciate that.
And sorry to keep jumping in, but I was just to highlight, I think that educational piece, Christian, is going to be so important in terms of the language, because in my experience in the classroom at any rate, and I think Ted Foss is a retired professor. I think he's probably gone through similar things in his work on China. At the start of the semester, I have to do a bunch of unpacking terminology with the class, right? Like in the first few weeks. And I didn't do that necessarily when I first started teaching. And so a difference is once people have that language, once they can approach something like the term privilege without being immediately defensive, it opens everything up so much. And like that in itself should create massive improvements, is what I would expect.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else, Christian?
No, that was it for me.
Colleen or Sarah, do you have any questions? Oh, Sarah, you're on mute.
No, I first and foremost just want to thank Rashida. I think this was very thorough. I think, to the point that Christian made, I think there's a lot of additional discussion, I'd like to have with David around structure and kind of where staffing supports are, understanding this is a great deal of work and important work. And I want to understand, from a support standpoint, if we're already, and maybe this is a question for you, David, based on this, is potentially giving some feedback to the board around, based on the current environment and the staffing structure and kind of your immediate plans, what areas you feel like we can undertake in what order, and frankly, what the board might need to be aware of. And this isn't, you have to answer this now, clearly we can come back to it. But what the board may need to be aware of as we think about what some of these approaches might mean for, our prioritization of some of the projects we've got in front of us. Because I think this is something we're all very committed to and really understanding the impacts.
No, I thought it was, I agree with what has been said. It was very thorough in the making sure we have the right common understanding of terms and language has been something that in many aspects of over the last several years, both in government and politics and my day job and everything, has really been something that has frustrated me in a lot of things. It's like we cannot tackle a problem if we don't know how to talk about it in a common set of definitions. So that I really appreciated, along with pretty much everything that was in there. I don't think there was anything that I looked at and was like, I'm not sure about that. But I look forward to working with you and hoping, and moving forward on and putting a lot of this into action and putting this into action over the next period of time, and not just make this a thing we do and then kind of put on a shelf, as much as make it a part of our ongoing practice. I think is going to be one of the key parts, is making this part of what we continually do as an organization, not just a hey, we did this thing. So I'd like, so I think that's going to be really important as we move forward with this.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
So Rashida, one last question. How would you like to see the Oak Park Public Library in 2022?
Well, I will tell you, ultimately what I would like to see and hear are representative stakeholders articulating that they felt seen and named and heard and understood, and that ideally they would see and name and hear and understand each other intersectionally in ways that they didn't before. So that for me would be the primary goal, because I think from there, that impacts programming, operations. It impacts the community at large. I'm doing a similar work with D97. And so I think this is also just a really interesting time. It's sort of ripe for the picking when so many organizations in one village are moving towards the same thing with the same kinds of recommendations and priorities. So the intersection of stakeholders talking and getting resources they need and understanding why they all actually need the same resources, and institutions having that same intersectionality around a shared and common language, that makes me excited for Oak Park.
So you have no passion?
I got no stake in this at all, Ted. Whatever happens, happens.
Just rolling with it.
Thank you all so much for being willing to do this and for being courageous in doing this in a time when we didn't know that a pandemic would come and further illuminate the need for all of this work. And so maybe perhaps for such a time as this, indeed.
All right. Thank you, Rashida. This was excellent.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And you all know how to contact me if you have anything else. Otherwise, I'll wait to hear back from David. Thank you all also for your work, and I hope that you are staying healthy and safe and all the things.
Trying day by day.
Yeah. So I can sign off now, yes?
Yes.
Thank you.
You are free to go.
All
Thank
right.
you, Rashida.
I'm gonna go feed children. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right, thank you.
Okay. That was excellent. Moving back onto staff reports. We have David's Executive Director report.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you to Rashida for joining us and for sharing her explanation of her report and for all of your questions. As I mentioned here in my narrative, it is my intention now to move from having retained Rashida to do the assessment and write the report to engage her as our consultant for the remainder of the journey. So unless there are any concerns or additional questions that the board has about that, I'll begin a conversation with Rashida now about taking on that work. She and I have already begun that conversation, but we left it at the point where we would wait for the board to discuss the report and have a presentation at this meeting. So again, thank you. And again, unless there are concerns or unless the board wants to have it on their agenda to take some formal action on this report, that's my intention now, to begin to work with her to develop the action plan to go and take us through the rest of the journey that she's outlined in her document.
David, I do just have one question for you surrounding the report.
Yeah.
And I just was particularly wanted to know your thoughts about the report. And specifically, was there anything you found surprising? And was there anything you felt that kind of was true? You kind of knew that already?
Yeah, as Rashida mentioned, there was not, when I read it and she and I talked about it together, there was nothing about the report or anything in it that she said that surprised me. There are things that she says in the report and challenges that she outlines that I indeed recognize as challenges and things that are going to take a lot of work to unpack and to break down. I'll just give a couple of brief examples. One of them certainly is the culture of the library as an organization and the profession. She mentions in her report the idea of libraries as neutral spaces, and this kind of work, anti-racism work, is purposely and intentionally not neutral. And so there is a tension there, an automatic tension that we are going to have to discuss, unpack, and work through. And that's going to include, or I should say, it's going to require a lot of work by both staff members and board members. It will be challenging to make sure that the advisory committee, that the advisory group that Rashida describes in the report is constituted in just the right way. We're not going to have a lot of chances to get that right. And I'm confident that with her help, it can be constituted in the right way. And by that, I mean making sure that the exactly right people are a part of that group and a part of that conversation. So that's going to take a bit of work to figure that out as well. So again, a number of things in the report that she and I have already started talking about that I recognize as challenges. They're going to require a lot of hard work, but there was nothing about it that necessarily surprised or shocked me.
Thank you. I appreciate saying that. I don't really have any follow-up questions. I definitely want to move forward. I don't think we need to take a formal action around it unless you do, Matt.
I don't at this time. I think we all, by voting to proceed with this, this work and participating with Rashida's discussion, I think that's an acknowledgement from the board, from my perspective, that we see the value in this work and that we want to continue to do it. There's very few things that we have ever done that we just collect and put aside. I think we've all done a very good job of making sure we continue to move on a number of topics. So I don't see a reason to, unless anybody else feels it. I think the past actions we've taken on this topic is an indication of our continued support of this initiative.
All right, great. Thank you, Matt. Then the only other thing I wanted to say before you move on to other reports is that we are very excited to have gotten a grant from our regional library system to engage Nancy Luna Jimenez, founder and president of the Luna Jimenez Institute for Social Transformation, to conduct our staff learning day, staff institute day, which this year will be a completely virtual event on Friday, June 12th. And there's a little bit of a description again in my narrative, and there'll be a lot more information forthcoming. And I think that it would be more than appropriate for trustees to participate in that day if they would like to do so. Part of the grant also was an opportunity for all Rails, all library system members to also take part in her program. So after offering it to our staff alone in the morning on that day, it will then be offered as a webinar for all of the members of the regional library system in the afternoon.
So David, I want to thank you for making it available to Rails as well, because I remember when I first joined the library board, it was so wonderful to meet other people from other local libraries. In fact, I have this little brain from a former Rails meeting,
Yeah.
which I keep on my desk. But it is so wonderful to hear the stories and the experiences of our other local libraries.
Yes, and well, actually, that option for all Rails members to participate was a stipulation of the grant in the first place. So that was a part of the grant that we were applying for. But it's a great opportunity. All right, well then, if there are any other questions about my part of the report, then Matt, you can feel free to move on to the other reports.
Yep, we'll go on to 6B, the digital library during COVID.
And again, this month, you can see the incredible amount of work that staff have continued to do in virtual and digital environments for our community. And the ways that with Mallory Edgar's support are able to measure that engagement. So the report, I think, pretty well speaks for itself. So I'll open it up for any comments or questions that you all have. And many of the members of the leadership team are on this call, and I believe Mallory is as well. So if there are questions that you have that I need their support to answer, I will just call on them.
It's Ted Foss again. I've been putting a lot of holds on in this last couple of months. And I noticed about a week ago that the holds I cannot do from other libraries within SWAN. And that was a change, because now my hold list has all of these things that I had for the last month and a half. But now they're saying, okay, you can't even put this on hold.
Yeah, Ted, I'll perhaps have Lori or Elizabeth chime in here, but yeah, I think that was a change that SWAN, the organization, made in order to manage the fact that we don't know when it will be possible for our system and our system and SWAN to begin to transport materials back and forth from one library to another. But Lori or Elizabeth, if you're listening to this and you can jump in with any better explanation than that, please do so.
And of course I understand it, but I would still like to have my little list there.
Ah, I get it.
It is Elizabeth. I would say that what David said already, it's accurate, and primary reason is that we are not able to transport materials, and we don't know when each library will be opening and when Rails will start moving materials, that it really makes sense to start placing holds from at the home library, and then we can really focus on those items which are available on site without movement. So.
Thanks,
And
Elizabeth.
of course I understand, but I just want my little like reading list keep on going.
Yes, we understand. And we hope that trials would start services very soon, but we have to be patient. So this is my answer.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Are there other questions from trustees about the digital?
See Marianne.
Yeah,
Have your
so
hand up.
I had two things. One, I just wanted to know, I love the pivot to the many voices, many stories that you're planning for this summer, in part because I read The Best We Could Do by Thibault earlier this year, and I loved it so much, and I'm really delighted to see that you guys picked it as one of your 6 books. And I was thinking, I don't know how the library is planning to roll that out, but it might be nice to include a link to the TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, The Dangers of a Single Story, as a, it's like I can't remember, a 3 or 5 minute thing. It's a big classic thing, and I feel like it would tie in very nicely to the way you're pivoting. So I wanted to suggest that. I'll type it into the chat so you have the details. The other question I had, and I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure where this is in the board packet. I think it was in this section. At some point you mentioned that that we're still paying staff who are not able to work from home, which I'm very much in favor of. But I'm wondering if there is, I don't know, if it were me, if I were a shelver and were getting paid but not able to come in, I would actually feel frustrated that I wasn't able to do my job. And I'm wondering if you can just, David, tell us briefly, sort of like, is there educational stuff we're offering them? Is there stuff they can do from home that's helpful to the library or the community? And I'm sorry if that's not in this section, but so I'm putting it out there.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Marianne. Yes, there are a lot of ways that we have been working to engage all of the staff, including staff who have not had anything specific to do at home for work or had anything specifically assigned to them. There are many, for instance, virtual and digital learning opportunities that Sharon Grimm and our leadership team and management team are informing our staff members about almost every day. So there are certainly those opportunities. Okay. And yes, it's unfortunately the sum of the opportunities is very limited. And I think, for some of our, especially our very part-time staff, it is the virtual and digital environments can be a challenge depending on the access that they have. But in whatever ways we can, we have been trying to engage all of our staff.
And then to that end, David, can I meant to drop you a note about this and I forgot. One thing I saw a library doing, some library somewhere, right? During COVID times was that they had opened up an extra like call line for like seniors who were having trouble navigating the tech. And so I just wanted to put that on your radar if it wasn't already. I'm certainly in various venues that I'm working in, I get stressed out by the tech sometimes, and I know that I still cannot convince my dad to even try FaceTiming with the grandkids. So so maybe that might be something, if people who are comfortable on the phone might be able to answer some phone calls. I don't know. They're not librarians.
We're staff are answering phone calls every day. We've got our phone system set up so that all calls that are coming in are going to a general box that's accessible to all of the members of the leadership and management teams, and those calls are monitored every day.
Has call volume ticked up at all, or no? Or
I don't know. I'm not sure if the call volume total is ticked up, but I would say that as more and more people are finding their way to our digital and virtual services, they are having to call when they're having some challenges figuring out how to access some of them.
Right. Right. Okay. All right. Sorry. Thanks. That
Oh,
addresses
that's
my.
great. That's great. Thank you.
By the way, the Oak Park District is doing the same thing. And I had a question about Taylor Park here where I live, and they did a beautiful job of getting back to me within an hour.
Mhm.
So Oak
Great.
Park is really trying.
That's great.
Good. Any other questions or comments regarding the digital library report?
Oh, I was just excited to see that you're still going to do beads. My daughter was very worried about summer reading beads. So one parent to another, thank you for.
Excellent. All right. Good. Okay. 6C, COVID response plan.
All right, so as again I mentioned in my report, staff, particularly the leadership and management teams, have been working on this report, on this plan, and all the procedures every single day. We're reviewing it, adding to it, gathering information for it every day to improve it as much as we can. I think you probably took note of some changes in it from the last time it was presented to you in April. It is now called the COVID-19 Response Plan for Buildings and Services. And given the fact that many other agencies and organizations, particularly the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago, have adopted a language of phases, we intentionally stopped using that word to avoid any confusion, because we wanted to be clear that the state of Illinois' phases do not necessarily, and what those phases permit or not permit, do not necessarily coincide with our phases or what we're now calling our service levels. So we've moved from a language of phases to a language of service levels. But I think the bulk of the plan and procedures has remained true to what you saw and approved back in April. We are preparing now for the, I think, certainty that the governor of Illinois is not going to extend his blanket stay-at-home order past the end of May. And as you know, that has been one of our guideposts. I've said all along that we were not going to bring our staff back into the building in any substantial way until that order or directive was altered. And it's looking now as though it will be for the end of May. And so as of now, unless that changes again and then compels our timeline to change, we are planning to begin to bring staff members back into the main library on June 1st. And then at that point, we will begin to plan and prepare our buildings and spaces. We will finalize our procedures. We will make sure that we have the supplies that we need. And we will begin to test our delivery method to begin to get physical materials back into the hands and homes of our patrons again. And again, assuming we get back into the building on June 1st, then we would plan to begin that, that service on Monday, June 15th, right after our virtual staff day. Now, I just want to make sure a few things are clear. And you can ask questions about them if they're not, but I hope from the plan that they were when you read through the summary of library service levels. We are not planning to open either Dole or Mays branches anytime soon. We have decided that there is simply no way to control physical distancing in those spaces. So for a time, we will only be using the main library space. When we begin to deliver physical materials again on June 15th, that will still preclude members of the community from actually coming into our building. We do not, the earliest that we would expect to be able to allow people back into our building for any reason would be in July. So beginning on June 15th, it would be a method where we would be carrying materials out that have already been bagged or boxed to place into people's cars or to place on tables so that they can walk away with them if they're walking to the library. That would be a method by which a patron has already pre-selected what they want, assuming that it is still on our shelves, and that they have made an appointment to arrive within a specific window of time at the main library to pick up those materials. We will then, from June 15th to July 1st, be moving ahead with that plan, assuming that all goes well and there are no significant challenges. Then on July 1st, we would begin finally to be able to allow our patrons to begin to return their materials. Hopefully, we will have a little bit more authoritative medical scientific information by then to let us know exactly how long we need to be prepared to quarantine our materials. Right now, with the latest information we have, we are planning to quarantine for at least 7 days. And that means that we have to have the space to do that. And that means we have to be intentional about the way that we do that. We're discussing a number of possibilities right now, including using one or the other of our two smaller branches as our quarantine center so that materials can be placed there and left there untouched for the time that we've designated before they would be handled again and then prepared for recirculation. And then as we move through the service levels, you see then when we would begin to offer additional services, allowing people to come back into the main library, allowing people on a limited basis to use public computers, and then finally through later service levels, being able to reopen additional spaces such as our branches and being able to allow people to use our meeting and our study spaces again. So I think that's a lot of information and a basic summary of what is in our plan now. I'll stop for now and ask for your questions.
Okay, I have three
Yes.
questions. So you have a note here about increased vulnerability to illness. Staff members over a certain age and or with underlying health conditions may not be allowed to return to work in the library buildings. E-work may be available. I wanted to bring to the board's and staff's attention that there may be a legal issue there because UIC was originally sent out a notification to faculty saying that employees over 60 would not be allowed to teach in the classroom during fall semester, I assume because they were afraid of liability should someone get sick and sue the university. And they've dropped that and are rethinking everything because there is a ADA issue with requiring that. So I wanted to, you
Yes.
may need to rethink that, David. So
well, actually, I think Mary Ann, we already have. I think
okay.
I think more recent information we've gotten that Billy has studied indicate that we will have to think a little bit more specifically about how we handle that. And that note in the plan is probably an older note that we're going to need to alter.
Great. Just wanted to make sure you guys were aware of that. The note about childcare, staff members can apply for emergency FMLA leave. I don't know the answer to this, but I know that for essential workers, the YMCA and so on had set up some childcare that was available to them. And I would be curious to know, I know that Mayor Lightfoot was considering libraries as sort of in this next phase as being to some extent like a somewhat essential part of reopening the economy. I saw some remarks from her about that. And so I would be curious whether there is some kind of state funding that would be available to supplement childcare needs for library staff. So I'm just putting it on your radar as maybe that's worth looking into.
Thanks.
And then finally, I guess my final note is that as much as I want the library open again, of course, physically, my sense is that the government is, and the governor, all of the officials are going to be getting, a lot of social pressure to open much earlier than I personally think is safe. And we are, and so this is kind of my statement to the board on this, is that we are fortunate that Oak Park is in a position that we can be more cautious, and I think we should. So I wouldn't just because and that means that if we decide to go that route, if David decides to go that route, we may face some critique from the community that's like, why can't you, I need you to open Mays right away, or whatever it is, right? The governor says it's okay. And if we're sort of in agreement that things are moving too quickly and we don't have, I don't know whether you guys saw the things about the schools. I can't remember now which schools they were, but some of the schools that have opened in other countries have seen massive increases in COVID cases as a result, which is really what you would expect. So until we have a vaccine, and I hate to say this, but it really may be a very long haul. I think the idea that we're going to have in-person meetings in August seems very optimistic to me. I don't think the board should be meeting in person in August. And in general, I would say if the library moves to this service level 1, I guess, where you have pickup of reserved materials, I would still say any staff members who can work remotely should continue to work remotely. Just because you are able to enter the building now, you should not be putting yourself at risk or contributing to community spread. So I don't know if the rest of the board agrees with me on this, so I wanted to put that out for discussion or.
Sure. Well, it makes me personally very happy to hear you say all of that, Marianne, because it is exactly and precisely the way we are talking as a leadership team, and how we have been proceeding all along. Our message, my message to our staff from the very beginning of this to today, is that first and foremost, we are concerned about the health, the safety, the well-being of our staff members and our patrons. And we are not going to do anything or compel anyone to do anything that is going to put them at unnecessary risk. And that includes moving too quickly through a phased reopening or through these service levels, or reopening any spaces or resuming any services, unless we think we can do any of those things in a safe a manner as possible. And yes, we are already getting some questions, not nearly as many as I thought we might, and perhaps not nearly as many as I think some of my colleagues in other communities are getting, about restarting and reopening and returning to normal. We've gotten a few. And if you've seen any of my responses to some of those queries, you know that I've said that as much in my message, that everything we're doing is guided by our need to preserve people's well-being and health. And that is going to be the first question we ask before we move forward through these service levels, or to reopening, or to resuming services.
Yeah, Marianne, I would to comment about when the meeting in August, when Dave and I talked about that was predicated on the governor's executive order that is easing the open meetings requirements, that allows us to do it this way now. If that, if he has continued that, I think we would continue in August to meet virtually, but it's all, if, the governor may remove that option for us to do that, which is why I put it as an August at the earliest.
That's helpful, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'll just add, I had one other thought that I forgot to mention, which is I think there is I think there is a large extra burden on people's mental health during a pandemic. And so one thing I wanted to ask about, I think, you know, if people are going back into the building, they may be feeling additional fear, or they're having stresses from trying to work from home and dealing with technology. And I know that the library already has, obviously, health insurance and mental health services available to staff, but I'm wondering whether it might be worth putting on the agenda, your radar, however we want to think about it, something additional that is specifically sort of staff mental health during a pandemic. Thinking through, do we need to budget additional resources in some way for that? So I wanted to raise that question as well.
Billy, if you're listening and you're still on the call, would you mind just jumping on for a moment and talking about addressing what Marianne is talking about?
Yeah, I think there's. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I think there's two things I wanted to address. One of them, when you talk about staff having access to health insurance and resources, that's only about for the library provided insurance, it's only about 60 of our 146 employees. Now, I'm sure that other staff members have other health insurance, but we talked about this earlier in leadership team, I think it was on Monday, that there may be some people who are uncovered or not covered. Then also, our employee assistance program is available to all staff, and we have been regularly communicating about that resource. I know I've personally shared it with the staff members I've talked to who've contacted me over different concerns. Beyond that, we are looking into ways for staff to stay connected. But from like a mental health perspective, we haven't looked at additional resources at this time.
I wonder whether it might be worth just talking to someone in the field about, you know, what they might recommend, like, you know, you or David or someone in leadership having a conversation with them. And we're all, you know, the way we were talking about this when we started converting all of our courses to remote was that we were trying to, you know, fly the plane in the middle of building it. And so there is a lot of making stuff up as we go along. But I think more and more I'm seeing the mental health aspects coming out in a variety of ways in the different organizations I'm in. And so it would be great if the library could be proactive about that.
And Marianne, I agree with you. I feel like a month ago, I was ready to return to the library and I was fine. And even myself going back to the library occasionally to do payroll related tasks, I go, yeah, this is a lot different and this is going to be different. And I know if I'm feeling that way, I'm not alone. So
yeah, no, we're seeing things like, you know, even an increase in agoraphobia, which is fascinating. So people who have been at home for 2 months are now, you know, actively frightened to leave their homes, for example. So and I think a lot of this can be addressed with some counseling. So it'd be great to be ahead of the curve on that.
okay. That sounds great. I'll look into that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Billy. Matt, are there any other questions?
I did not. Did anyone else? Christian, Sarah, Colleen? Anything from you? Okay. Ted?
Nope.
Yeah, I didn't want to leave you out there. Okay, I think we're good covered on that, so we can move on to financial reports.
Great. So I wanted to make sure that none of the trustees had any questions or concerns about the corrected March statement that you see that Jeremy provided some notes on in his narrative. If you have any questions or concerns about it, either I or Jeremy, who's on the call, would be happy to answer them.
This is Ted. I was just a little concerned that this is corrected and we didn't notice any problems earlier. So I'm thinking, do we really look at the budget sheet that well?
All right. Well, if there aren't any questions or concerns about that, then Matt, you can move on to the April statements if you'd like.
I would just can I just comment on that to speak to Ted's comment. One of the things I will, just so you know, I will be working with Rita to develop some additional checks before that, and so we'll be looking at some reports. I'll be working with her to do some reports, so we should be able to catch these kind of things beforehand, and I'll be happy to share that with the board as we get into June. Some of those reports. Ideally, we wouldn't want to add more reports than necessary, but we'll have those available.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you. Matt, any other questions about that?
Not from me. I'm not seeing any other hands go up. So we'll go on to the April distribution resolution. Are there any questions regarding that document for 7B? All right, is there a motion to approve the corrected March reconciliation and the April distribute resolution?
So moved.
By Sarah, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mary Ann. All right. Any further discussion? I see no hands going up. Will the secretary take the roll, please?
Mary Ann Monraj,
Yes.
Ted Foss,
It looked like he said yes, but I think he was on mute. Space bar.
I can come back to you, Ted. Matt Ruth,
Yes.
Colleen Burns, Christian Harris, going once, Christian Harris,
Possibly his
going back to
Screen is
Ted Foss.
thumbs up, Ted. You're still on mute, Ted. Is that a thumbs up, Ted, for yes? All right.
How
Coming
about
back to,
Christian? We lost Christian. Christian, thumbs up. I still can't see Christian. Is he frozen?
he's lagging a bit.
Christian, you can text. Is that allowed, Rita?
Fine. It's fine.
Okay, moving on.
All right, those are approved. I heard a yes from
You guys
Christian.
hear me?
Can hear you now.
Okay. All right. All right.
Okay, so we'll go on to our 7C, the April 20 financial report.
All right, this is Jeremy's narrative, and there's a lot of information that he's put in here in addition to describing the month's expenditures and revenue, including information that you see where he describes the external economic environment that I think will be important for us to continue to think about as we move forward through this year. And some information that was requested at last month's board meeting about a review of capital projects. And you can see from that part of his narrative where he describes and enumerates projects that are currently in process, things that he and staff in various service areas, particularly in our facilities services area and IT, have identified as high priority, and other things that we have identified that could safely be deferred if we need to defer them. So again, as you know, Jeremy's on the call, so questions that you've got about any part of this narrative, he'd be happy to answer.
Jeremy, I have a question about the COVID-19 supplies. So I guess looks kind of expensive, especially since the library is not open quite yet. So imagining that once we start reopening, we'll be going through even more and need more supplies. So I guess my question is, what line item are we currently taking this from? Is it over budget? Is that line item over budget? And do you think we as a board need to kind of budget out plans for supplies and everything else for the next 6 months?
Yeah, right now, most of that is coming from supplies. And it is still below target level in this month. It's 31% out of 33% of the year expended. So we're still on target with that. One of the challenges is with the COVID-19 supplies for prevention is just the availability of it. We've been working with through SWAN, through Rails, different vendors. David set up an Amazon business account which gave us access to COVID-19 supplies. So we've been buying as we can. We're still having difficulty finding hand sanitizer and things like that. The supplies budget, we are tagging all of those items. Rita set up a project in our accounting system so we can track all of that. And David and I have been working with through IEMA, which is the state agency to work through FEMA to get public assistance to get some of that money reimbursed. And so that's one of the things that we're going to do, is try and balance out some of those expenses. As far as whether we can get that or not, we have to provide those kind of protections for the staff and the patrons coming in. It's just it's a requirement, but we would want to do it anyway. So we are keeping an eye on it. As far as the supplies, we'll probably see even a bigger uptick in the supplies budget. Whether it matches what we would be spending on supplies if we were open, that we'll have to see. The average monthly regular supplies budget for all of the work that staff were doing inside there has not been happening because of the closures. So there is some balancing effect on that. But as of right now, we're still on target for supplies budget, but it is something we'll keep an eye on. Does that answer your question?
And can I just add for the,
Yes.
oh, sorry,
Yes.
Christian, I didn't mean to step over you. Were you done or?
I just want to say yes, that did answer the question. And then just quickly, as far as other potential expenditures we're going to have to make, do you see any projected increases as far as digital services go and things of that nature? I'll probably just be asking every month, just checking in with you.
That's all right, and that's something that we can do. We can keep tabs on and report each month in the same section if the board is comfortable with that. And you'll see also in the section the digital content. Barbara and the digital services team have been working with that. So they have increased, as you can see there, increased the limits in Canopy and Hoopla, and and they'll be keeping an eye on that to see at what point do we need to pull back. There is some flexibility within those budget lines to shift funds. But again, there may be some balancing effect too, because we haven't been purchasing a lot of the physical material that we would have been over this past 2 months. So we'll have to see how that balances out as well.
Okay, that was it. Thank you.
And I was just going to note, because of the hand sanitizer thing, that I hope that somewhere in the plan for reopening is a a staff training on issues like hand sanitizer is really only recommended for situations where you can't wash your hands with soap and water. So, and a lot of people are not aware of some of these things, right? And a training on like proper mask wearing, because if you don't wear your masks correctly, you can actually have a greater risk of infection. If people who are new to wearing masks will often like reach up and be adjusting them all the time, et cetera, and really be kind of carrying germs, or they'll unthinkingly say like, oh, I don't want to, someone's having a hard time hearing me, I'm going to pull my mask down so I can speak a little louder. And then of course they've contaminated the entire environment. And so everyone I know in medicine says it takes a little while to really train yourself to not touch your face. So anyone who we're sending back into the public environments, I hope we can, I think now there are YouTube tutorials and so on all of this. So maybe the staff will be putting together a set of those. You know, like it's been frustrating seeing that some people are just like, well, these people have PPE, but they haven't been trained how to use it. And that's a huge gap. Okay.
Yes, we've already, again, with Billy's help and Sharon's help, we've already been lining up that kind of training for all staff as they would prepare to come back into our space.
Any other questions? Well, I just had to, like, as we're dealing with like has there been an a consideration for the PPE and other related supplies for possible cost increases and further demand, supply issues as the state begins to open up and more businesses need to purchase more? I know we've been kind of stocking up a little bit as ahead of time as we can, but have you given thought as to that process, as more people need to start going through more or less than what they thought they needed?
We were having a meeting today with Elizabeth and Lori, and talking a little bit about just that fact. If we don't have hand sanitizer, what are the next steps and things like that. I think it's hard to judge. David shared a great document from Toledo Lucas County, and they have a really in-depth, thorough document, and it talks about having a 30-day supply. Well, one of the issues is we don't know how quickly we're going to go through it and whether we're going to be able to replenish those supplies. June is going to be telling for us as we start to actually look at the facilities, see how staff use these with training, how efficiently we can use the supplies that we have, and how quickly we can replenish. One of the things I've been trying to do is each week, try and buy supplies that are available and see how quickly we can get those in, just to get some sense of how, what is available right now. And it is challenging even now. The disinfectant wipes and the hand sanitizer are hard to come by. So I actually have some vendors who have contacted me when they do come in. And so then, okay, let's get 4 cases of that. And so it will be a touch and go over really as we start opening to see how staff use it in June, assuming that we open in June for staff. And then beyond that, when we start curbside service, what's the additional consumption? And then beyond that, as we actually open up to the public, I think part of the decision to open up wider at the different service levels will have to account for the available supplies. So that's something that we're going to have to gauge and see. And that's really why we're trying to manage our inventory more carefully in a little more controlled environment than the typical supplies budget and supplies for staff that we've done in the past. So it is kind of a wait and see, but we are trying to plan for it.
So David, Leland must be coming up to you.
Why is that?
I just saw you like looking at a little dog.
Yes, he wants my attention desperately. Sorry.
It's okay. Several of us are managing that as well with other small creatures.
Yes, and Matt, we saw your two daughters come through the curtain.
Yeah, they wanted to say goodnight before they went to bed. Katie wanted me to read her story. She's like, but you read good stories. And I was like, oh, great, thanks, Guilt. All right. If there's no other questions or comments regarding the response plan for the buildings and services or the financial reports, we'll go on to additional reports for iGov.
Saturday's iGov meeting didn't take place.
Okay. Council of Governments continues to meet weekly regarding with representatives from Forest Park, River Forest, and Oak Park, the relevant bodies with libraries, parks, school districts, discussing, and the villages, discussing their various pieces. So that's kind of that, and we'll have that tomorrow morning, bright and early, 8 a.m.
Yes, indeed.
ILA legislation and advocacy. You probably have seen in an email recently. We had our conference call last week about advocacy. Not sure, in partnership with the Public Policy Committee, not really sure exactly what was still going to be moving as far as legislation, because at that time there wasn't a firm confirmation as to when they were going to be meeting back in Springfield, which they are going back in tomorrow at a convention center for the House and their usual chamber for the Senate. They have a very, very slim agenda that has come out for what they're going to be looking at. So still looking at those pieces, but the lobbying for that is going to be not sure what that looks at, but you will have seen in recent emails, probably from the ILA, regarding bigger than a building, as ILA works to address public libraries and academic libraries' approach to services, as we have shut down physical facilities in most to all places, and as we approach reopening, the idea of making sure that communities still have an understanding and appreciation for what we do besides being a building full of books, and that we provide services and programs beyond that. So I'll make sure to send that around, what that website, but you may have seen it in a ILA email, but I'll make sure to link to some of the relevant materials to everyone on the board.
Thank you, Matt.
Yep. Anything from the Friends?
Friends met via Zoom. David, I think, helped them muddle through it. It was frankly, I think, more of a chance for them to connect than really move business forward. There is still discussion about, and I think there are varying levels of kind of acknowledgement about the book fair probably not taking place or needing to be thought of very differently. One, I think, very useful suggestion for the larger team was a recommendation that they in this month's meeting or in their next meeting, have a separate conversation about establishing a fundraising committee, which will, in essence, be about thinking beyond the book fair and really understanding that their strength may be better suited to identifying, major gift donations and bequests and things that frankly would secure them far greater assets for much less labor. But I don't know that I got the assumption David can speak up as to whether or not everyone had comfortably relinquished their hopes for the book fair. I think there were a few people who felt like maybe we should just hold on a little longer. But, by and large, their conversation was mostly about just reconnecting and then kind of establishing this as the new normal for their next meeting.
Thanks, Sarah. I think you're right. I think there are still a couple that are holding out whatever hope they can hold out. But I will say that this was the first time in 7 years that I have ever heard any of them suggest that there might be a different way of raising money for their organization and the library other than a book fair. And it only took a worldwide pandemic for that to happen.
So if any community members are very passionate about raising money for the library, we may have some other vehicles that would be welcome at the party. I have volunteered to be a member of the fundraising committee. So please refer inquiries to me. I'm happy to steward them along.
Okay, this is Ted Foss, no comment.
Ted will be selling heirloom tomatoes to benefit the library.
Sarah, at some point would love to talk to you about the things I learned at the ALA conference in January surrounding fundraising. So you could be
our first committee visitor.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. But I'm glad to hear that they're thinking of new, innovative ways, we'll call it, to get money.
Okay. All right. Let's go. All right, going on to employment. What a time to start with our special, as a separation, sorry. Okay. If there is nothing else, any other things, we will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Sarah, is there a second?
Second.
Mary Ann by a hair. Will the secretary take the roll on our adjournment?
Happy to. Mary Ann Mohanraj.
Yes.
Ted Foss.
Yes.
Matt Fruth.
Yes.
Christian Harris.
Yes.
Colleen Burns.
Yeah.
And Sarah Glavin.
Excellent. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night, and we will see you in a month.
I'm sorry, Matt, can I just tell anyone who's still here, I know this isn't official meeting anymore, but I'm sorry, I can't help multitasking. Someone did just post in Oak Park Working Moms. Does anyone here have a connection to any folks at OP libraries? I'd like to propose a bookmobile as we're missing our libraries hard. Think this would be a unique and potentially safe way to continue to sustain our child's interest in books in the library during these COVID times. So I've written a response to that. Someone tagged me into it. I just think we should keep an eye out for that. I think we're going to start getting more and more of these.
Thanks, Mary Ann. Thank you.
Yep.
I'm just posting on the chat if anyone's looking for things to do in free time. I don't know that any of you have any free time, but especially for those folks who are furloughed or can't go to work. I have a big team that is doing the text support for the census because they can't do field work. So if anyone's looking, they have both a call-in center and a text to support census outreach. And the city is really struggling. So if you're thinking about doing something civically minded, it'd be a great use of your time.
Thank you, Sarah.
I'm doing it tomorrow.
All right. All right, everyone. Take care, and we will see you later.
Thanks, everybody.